Welcome to Writer Syndrome, a podcast about writing from start to finish. I'm Russ Capasso, and joining me as always is Tim Letney. We have a special episode today as we're joined by JD Edwin, author of the soft sci-fi fantasy trilogy Headspace. JD has also published short fiction work through Short Fiction Break. Her latest work, The Write Fast System, is a guide on streamlining your writing process and is out now. JD, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, pretty excited. I first want to say that you've written a lot of articles for thewritepractice.com, and that's actually how I discovered you. I read many of your articles actually while I was writing my book, and they were very helpful. So I just want to throw that out there right off the bat.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah, I think there's like a lot of stuff we want to kind of cover here. So we kind of get right into it. I know beforehand we talked about, you had mentioned that you were on a publishing contract and that's kind of changed this past year. I guess just to kind of get things going, like how was that process? And like, I guess, how did you get onto a publishing contract? Was it a querying process that was attached to it?
It was actually a really unusual process of how I got a publishing contract. And it's one of those things where, you said you've been with the Right Practice for a little while, and the Right Practice is all about networking, right? They teach you to connect with other people and put yourself out there. And how I got this contract is actually because I put myself out there after hesitating for a really long time. So I've gone through the querying thing before. I've gotten I think my record is 63 rejections in 3 months. It was loads of fun. But the press that I was contracted with is actually a part of the Right Practice. Were you aware of that?
I know, not at all.
Yeah, they have their own publishing house, the Story Cartel Press.
Okay.
And it's not very widely known, mostly because they are small op and they had to be very, very selective in who they took. So I actually first joined the Right Practice back when they were called the Story Cartel back in 2013. And they were operating on a forum. I don't know if you remember the little forums with the list of topics. That's what they were back then. And I didn't do a whole lot with it for a long time. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, they started having writing contests. And I submitted a short story on a whim. And I placed. They had 6 winners, and I was number 6. I placed. I was like, oh, okay, that's cool. So they held another one a few months later, and I submitted again, why not? And I placed again. And they had 2 categories, and I placed in both of them. And I was like, oh, okay. So what they were doing then was I think they still have this, the Short Story Break online magazine. Mm-hmm. And they would ask the winners to, be staff writers. And even though I didn't win, I placed so many times that they noticed me and they're like, hey, come write for us. So I ended up writing 30-something short stories for Short Fiction Break.
Wow.
So that was over, I want to say the mid 2010s, it was right after my son was born. So 2016, 2017, 2018. And then they started their 1 year to publish program where they help you write and self-publish in a year. And that was also when they were starting to explore this idea of opening up their publishing house. And Headspace, I did 1 year to publish twice. Headspace, the first book, was the project that I worked on the first time around. And I got such good feedback from it that when they started potentially looking for people for their publishing house, I went and said, hey, would you consider me? And this is, again, a matter of putting yourself out there and not being scared, because I was really self-conscious about doing that. This whole process, you guys are writers, you know what it feels like to put yourself out there. It's a lot, but you can't be scared to do it. And after they reviewed me, they actually signed me on for my trilogy. And it's been a great partnership because they're a small house, so we all work in a partnership instead of me having to follow all, if they have a set of rules with big publishers, you don't have a whole lot of control. Yeah. So working with a small publisher, we were able to partner and bounce ideas back and forth. So that was really great. But I was only contracted for the trilogy. And given the small op that they have, they can only take on very few authors at a time with their bandwidth. Yeah. So my trilogy wrapped up this year. I still work with them on some things. I still taught classes for the right practice, and they still help me with my nonfiction. But my contract with them is up now. And
Yeah.
it was a great experience. And it was a weird little road of how I got there.
Yeah. So you had the Headspace trilogy. You basically had that plan then. It wasn't just like you wrote the first book and it kind of came about later on. Like you had a plan.
Yeah,
I
wrote the first book, and then I decided maybe there's more.
Oh, there. Okay.
Yeah.
I had nothing planned. I wrote the first book, and then I saw there's more to the story.
Yeah.
Here. So
I'm curious about like relationship with them. Did they provide editors for you, or how was that like process, or was that kind of all on your own?
they provide, as part of the contract, they provided editing, formatting, and cover stuff, and they also provided audiobook.
Oh, nice.
And we actually were not able to do the audiobook for book 3 because this is the ups and downs of working with a small press.
Yeah.
The up is you can partner with them and they'll actually care and listen to what you have to say. I was very involved in the editing, the cover design, and all of that. But they also may run out of resources, and we ran out of resources for the third audiobook.
Yeah.
So I may eventually go in and try to complete that myself out of my own pocket, but I haven't decided if I will, because it's a lot of work.
Yeah.
And I just don't have the bandwidth for it right now.
What about the marketing components? So I'm always really curious about, even if it's a small publisher, do they step in? Do they do a little marketing? Do they budget for it? Or is that something that falls solely on the author?
Okay, this is, do you guys have much interaction with publishers at all, big or small?
I just got my first rejection letter
for
a query. So I only have about 150 more. And
so this is something that I didn't learn until I started working with Story Cartel Press and until I got more exposed to the industry of it, is that question is kind of complicated because it varies a lot. I'm sure you guys are familiar that there's different kinds of publishers. Like, you have the big publishers, then you have the smaller publishers, and then you have the vanity publishers who will do everything for a fee, that kind of thing. So these days, publishing is not what it used to be. Like 20, 30 years ago, even big publishers would do a lot more marketing for you. These days, even with a big publisher, there's a lot of onus on the author to do marketing. Now, Story Cartel Press is a little bit unique in that they already had the right practice community, because that's their bread and butter, to help do some of that marketing. So there was some of that helped with the initial boost. But after that, there was a bit of a combination where they ran some promos for me, and then I paid to run promos for myself. And with my contract ending, even during the contract, I had to run some of my own promos, paying for that. With my contract ending, obviously now I run my own promos. Being a small no-name author, you got to be willing to shell out the money for the promotion yourself. And in future projects, obviously, I'm going to have to pay for my own editing and formatting and things like that. But I'm actually going to return to querying with my next project, mostly because I've got my Headspace out there now. I can keep promoting it while I query. It doesn't feel like I'm rushing to get out there.
That was be my next question about if you're going to go the self-publish route or seek another publisher. Is there any reason why you wouldn't want to do self-publish? Or
I've done self-publishing before.
Okay.
I did self-publishing in 2013.
Okay.
I wrote a book. I was like 25 years old. I wrote this book. It took 3 years to write. It was 150,000 words long.
Wow.
And I self-published it. First of all, I wasn't very good because I didn't know what I was doing then.
Yep.
The other was I didn't understand marketing. But even aside from that, the process of self-publishing, I felt like I'm not built to wear that many hats. It just didn't work very well. Like some people, they're really good at doing all the different parts of it. And I really wasn't. So even if my book wasn't great, I don't feel like I did it justice just because I couldn't do all the parts very well. So I've decided to return to query and see how that turns out.
Yeah, I think Tim and I, we've been talking about writing for a long time, and he's just finished his project. He's working on querying, and I'd finished mine. And I was definitely, I think early on, I was like, yeah, I'm going to self-publish. And I was kind of on the fence for a little bit. And he's like, I'm going to query. That's where I'm going. That's the route I want to get a publisher. And I was like, I'm going to self-publish. And then finally I went for it. So we've been kind of on two different paths right now. It's been interesting to see.
That's really interesting. You can compare how your journey.
Yeah.
And I was like trying to pressure Russ. I was like, well, you know what? Why don't you just throw it out there? Why don't you query it? And he's like, no, I want to have like control. I want to make sure the product can get out when I want it out.
Yeah.
And in my head, much to your point, JD, is that I'd love to outsource some of the work. It's such a completely different part of my brain. Even querying really is this kind of
it's different,
lonely lack of dopamine drip process that I don't get the same kind of satisfaction that I get from writing or even planning to write or researching. It's not great. So I completely identify with
kind of
why
drains
you're going.
your soul a little bit.
One rejection at a time. So I was gonna get into when you were under contract, and I'm curious to see, because we were talking about when we were chatting over email, is your writing process from going from being under contract with a publisher versus like now. How has that changed?
So I was actually writing in my newsletter about this the other day. I'm a very type A personality. Like I thrive on deadlines and goals and milestones. So in the last 3 or 4 years, I wrote 4 books. Like I wrote a book every year. The drafts overlapped. I was doing editing on one and promo on another and writing on another one. That's amazing. Just how I went. And plus, when I signed it, they had the expectation of putting the books out one after like one every year. So I had to keep on top of that, which means I had to stick to a very rigid schedule to make sure. And I mean, I worked hard. I burned out hard because I was also, I work full time. I've got kids. It's a lot of work, but it was okay for me. Like I had some bad days. I had some burnout periods, but it was all right. In this summer, after the third book came out, actually that wasn't the end of my deadline. So October, when my nonfiction came out, that was my last deadline, and I taught a class for it, and that was my final thing. Like that was contracted to do. And I found myself without deadlines for the first time in about 3.5 years. And it felt like my brain just kind of deflated.
Now what? Now what do I do?
So I had a book ongoing right now, but I was working it on the side of all those other contracted things. So once my brain deflated from the lack of deadlines, it kind of overall deflated, like where you're like, it's over, now what? So I ended up taking about a month off, which was half of October and most of November, where I kind of rethought how I want to approach my writing, because I've been going full speed for so long that the idea of slowing down has been a little weird. So I originally had all these plans of all these things I'm going to work on before the end of this year. I've kind of let them go, to be honest. I'm like, you know what? It's okay to slow down for a while. So I'm in a bit of an adjustment period right now. I think I'm going to try not to hold myself to the 1 book a year rule, at least the best I can, because it's a lot. A book every year, it's a lot. So I'm going to slow down and try to focus on one project at a time rather than overlapping things like I've been having to do. But it's still very much in the experimental stage. It's still very fresh.
I couldn't imagine overlapping like that.
It was chaos. It was
after finishing the first book, I was like, wow, that was a lot of work. I kind of want to go on vacation now. I was like, I need a breather.
And we talking about it all the time on the cast, like not only churning out that much material, but balancing work and life and your family. That's amazing. You'd said before that when you were just starting Headspace, it was right after the birth of your first child.
My second. It was actually actually I didn't start Headspace then. That was when I started entering like the writing contests and stuff. When I started Headspace, it was 2018. My kids were 2 and 4.
Okay. They're just teething, so not a big deal. It's
fine. Go chew on something.
Go chew on something.
So I kind of shifting a little bit into writing this series because I'm fascinated about that process. And I'm going to start with this question. I'm sure you've gotten it quite a few times. I think I've seen some of the other interviews where someone's asked this, because Tim and I have this back and forth all the time. If you're a pantser versus a planner. And I know that's a big topic amongst everyone. I'm just curious for writing the Headspace trilogy. I know you said you wrote the first book and you're like, oh, there's more here. Like, what level of planning kind of went into that? Even starting with the first book with Headspace, where you just kind of like...
Tim read my nonfiction, right?
Yes,
I did, and I should get extra points for that because Russ
you should
did not read it.
I'm a planner, and the reason I'm a planner is because pantsing didn't work for me.
Yeah.
And if you read my nonfiction, I talk about how I arrived at that, which is the reason my first book way back when was so unsuccessful was because I pants the whole thing. And it took so long because I kept writing myself into corners. And when I do that, I will set it aside, come back to it 3 months later, completely forget where I was at. Eventually, when I wanted to work on Headspace, I went and I read a bunch of books on how to write fiction. Like the Write Great Fiction series, highly recommended, by the way, really useful. So I read a bunch of books on how to write fiction, and I thought about it, and I decided I'm going to try planning, just see how it goes. So, and all of this is in my nonfiction, so I won't go too deep into it. I can talk about it for days. But I'm kind of a combination. I'm a heavy planner, but there's also a pantsing element, because I believe if you do adequate planning, you can pants through it a lot faster. Like the first draft of Headspace took 5.5 weeks. It was 80,000 words. I wrote in 5.5 weeks because I planned it out. Anytime I get stuck, I can refer to my plan and go, okay, that's where I need to go next. So I believe that planning helps you pants faster.
What level of like discovery do you, so in your planning, do you have like, character profiles and everyone's hair color and all that sort of stuff? And like,
no, my planning is really bare bones. And I keep emphasizing this in my nonfiction as well, is if you over plan, you're going to make yourself feel bogged down. What you do is you do a loose framework. I do a loose skeleton, and then I do a scene list. And I don't follow them. They will change a lot by the time I actually write. But it gives me a rough guideline of this is where I'm trying to get to. So I'm never lost.
Yeah, I had started with the snowflake method a long time ago, which was helpful for me because I liked having like that kind of building upon something before and then getting to like, a scene breakdown where it's like I have something at least ahead of me, but I never let that be set in stone. I was like, okay, I can move around here a little bit, but I think originally I was like a lot of things I was planning too much. And got to ease back a little bit.
Way too much, like way too much. So when I was reading your nonfiction, when I was reading the Write Fast system, it like hit my soul, because so much of the things that you include in that book are things that I fumbled through, right? I had to find so much in the edit, and I wasted so much time in the edit by fixing things that I hadn't planned adequately for. And eventually I did. But geez, going through 100,000 words to make sure there's a consistency in character motivations. And
that's why you edit with the plot treatment, if you remember.
Yeah. And I ended up, so Russ is a big spreadsheet guy. I was fighting against the spreadsheets, but I needed one. I absolutely needed a scene breakdown. I needed character motivation breakdown, and it helped a ton. But just to plug your book a little bit, had I read that before I'd begun writing, it would have helped me a lot.
Make sure you leave me some reviews.
I'll leave you a review. Yeah. One thing that stuck out in the book too that I really enjoyed, that when you are kind of going through it and writing, I liked that you kind of said, give yourself permission to write badly.
Yes.
Like, i.e. like if you write yourself into a corner for some reason, don't get hung up on it. It's okay. Like, have a bad solution and note it, in your reference material that you're going to go back and fix it just to keep moving along. And I think that was a really, really good point.
I think that's a great point for first drafts too, because I got hung up on that so much where I'd go back and I edit and I'd be stuck on like one page trying to get myself into the next spot. It's like, just keep moving. And
that was actually something I learned from Stephen King's On Writing. Have you guys read On Writing? Yeah. Where he's like, no book should take more than 3 months to write. And I really took that to heart. I was like, it makes sense. You gotta do it quickly. Otherwise, you're not going to move through it.
Yeah.
Everybody's kind of got that, or most writers have that, like first book or first attempt. And I had one in my 20s, same thing, where I was editing as I went. It was really short. It took years and years and years. I was part of a writer's group, and it was just this, like, I edited 10 pages. And then I rewrote it, and I just never progressed into act 3. I never finished the thing because of that perfecting as I was writing. So
it's like that first book. It's important. It gets you understanding what not to do. It's like swimming through molasses to get through it.
For writing a series, coming back to this and kind of, I guess, bigger picture outlining, I'm curious because I'm kind of writing a series somewhat where I have, characters are all interconnected over 3 stories. They're not necessarily direct sequels to each other, but they're all tied together with something. Do you have any like general series tips or like how to keep that kind of, on track and in focus?
I actually write series the way you do.
Okay.
My books are not direct sequels. It's not like Harry Potter where like one book is right after the other.
Yeah.
Headspace, the book 2 is actually a prequel to Headspace, and then book 3 is a sequel. In Headspace, you've got the aliens, they came, they've got the game, and book 2 is actually about the host of the game, like how they got to where they are. And then book 3 takes place like a long time after book 1.
I think it's interesting because it's kind of, I'm just doing something similar to mine. I have the first book I just wrote, but I have a secondary character that everyone kind of really loved that I really enjoyed writing for. So I'm kind of writing a prequel story for her that's going to lead up to the events of the first book.
You're doing the exact same thing that I am.
And then I had an idea for a third book, which I was like, oh, that'll take place afterwards. And kind of, if you read all 3 together, it works out.
So the advice I would give on that is that if you're writing things like prequels, you have to make sure that what happens to your character in the early story makes sense for what they do in the later ones. And when you do it in reverse like that, it gets a little difficult because you're trying to kind of retrofitting history.
Yeah.
So you got to think about is what happened to them in this event makes sense for how they act later on. Yeah,
Tim and I were actually just talking about that, I think, recently. Or I was like, it's weird. I have to think about this character. She has certain behaviors and she's making certain decisions in the first book, and she's acts a certain way. I have to make sure that whatever's happening in this first book is a little bit different from that. She can't be the same way. She's got to be the things and experience she goes through in that first book have to kind of put her in this position in the book that's already out there. So,
well, best of luck on that. I actually think that's the best way to write series. I love that. I love writing series.
Just coming kind of out of place. Yeah, it's a fun process. So
curious if you were ever going to return to the Headspace world, or if that's done. Like if the trilogy itself is.
I am going to return to the Headspace world. I have a 4th book planned, and it's going to be the ultimate prequel of how all the games started in our universe.
Oh, very cool.
Like the early prequel. But it's very complicated because in writing that one, I have to consider all the other ones that are already written. And the characters that would be in that, you would meet them in the prequel, in book 2. You will meet them. And this is their story way before of how they end up joining this whole situation. But I don't know where that falls in my pipeline, partly because I think I need a break from that space to work on some other things. My current book is called Love, Death, and Other Things I'm Bad At. It's a cozy fantasy. That's like a new genre. I never used to hear that before, the cozy fantasy.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because it stuck out to me. I'd never heard it. I love that title, by the way. So what is... Can you give like a TDLR of cozy fantasy?
Have you guys heard of the book Legends and Lattes? That's like the cozy fantasy headliner now. But it's like the best I can describe it is that it's comedy or romantic comedy, that line, the heartwarming story, but in a fantasy set. So Love, Death, and Other Things I'm Bad At is about a girl who... It takes place in a world like ours, except there's magic, but magic is an outdated thing. Like people can use magic, but why would you? Why would you send a raven with your letters or an owl when you can send email? It's that kind of thing. Like there's magic, but why would you use it? So in this world, we've got Winnie. She is a customer liaison director person in a company, and she's trying to go up the career ladder, but some stuff happens, she gets fired, so she stumbles into another job that's always hiring, which is reaping. soul reaping under the Grim Reaper because they always need people for that. But she also gets onto the job right when the new Grim Reaper is taking over, because the Grim Reapers change every few hundred years. They hand down the mantle. And the new guy, he's young, he's inexperienced, his training is really out of date because they don't train you on how to social media when you're learning to read, to reap people. So he's very introverted and anxious about all this, and she befriends him, and it's a bit of a romantic comedy situation, but there's also corporate drama where there's people trying to make the power of reaping privatized so anybody can do it and they can monetize it. And she's trying to work with him like, no, you can't allow that to happen, but there's corporate drama and romance, corporate drama, magic.
Very cool.
Kind of switching over to nonfiction. What kind of led you to the path to writing the Write Fast system and kind of inspired you to do that?
I actually never considered that I would write a nonfiction. Yeah. It's not something I really thought of, but then I also never thought I would write articles either, I guess. Back in 2020, when I was first really starting to take my writing seriously, that was also my first round of 1 year to publish with the year of the pandemic. I was just looking for any way to expand my audience and reach out. And I asked the Right Practice, do you think I could try writing articles? They said, yeah, you can write one and we can see how it is. And then they liked what I wrote, so I kept doing that for a while. And eventually we got to a point where they said, if we collect some of these articles, there might be a book in here. And that was also when I was teaching classes on writing productivity, on how to write faster and be more productive with your writing. And eventually they said, this is your main brand as far as nonfiction goes. If you want to try to write a series of articles, we may be able to put into a book, which is how this one ended up. Most of the chapters in this book are present in some form or fashion in the Right Practice articles. It's just a lot more organized and concise. Condensed.
Yeah.
Just curious, the intentionality behind going with two separate author names for the fiction and the nonfiction.
I didn't think about that initially. My publishers, Right Practice, they're actually the ones who suggested I do that, because they said, so this is probably going to be my only nonfiction. I don't think I'm going to write anymore. The main reason is, as I started writing more articles in 2020 and 2021, at one point, Joe Bunting, the head of Right Practice, we were on a call and he said, what kind of author do you want to be? Are you a fiction writer or are you a teaching author? Because if you keep going down this path, you're going to end up a teaching author like me. And I was like, that makes sense. Because at that point I was teaching more classes. I was doing lectures at their virtual retreats. I was doing productivity classes. I was speaking to later writing groups that came. And that really gave me pause, because at one point I thought, well, you're a writer, right? You reach out to as many people as would be helpful. And are some authors who write fiction and nonfiction writing. But eventually he told me, and I'm realizing this is true, is if you're trying to gain your audience, you don't want to dilute your brand. You don't want to cast your net too wide. Like, I'm doing my newsletters, right? And people who read my newsletters, they're going to have expectations of what kind of content I produce. If I am preaching to a crowd of writers, I would want to talk about the technicals of writing. If I'm preaching to a crowd of fiction writers, they're going to want to hear about the more creative side of things and author life and things like that. So after my trilogy came out, I made the decision that, I don't write articles anymore either. I floated that idea by Joe as well. And he said, if I don't want to dilute my brand any further, I have already done it quite a bit, but going forward, I really should stop. And I agree with him. which is why I'm focusing on promoting my fiction now. And was also the one who suggested I put those books under 2 separate names so that when people search, I don't look like someone who's trying to cast a net over everything.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, I guess, just to really identify your target audiences with each piece of work.
Coming back to writing fiction versus nonfiction, how was that process different from, I'm sure it's vastly different.
Nonfiction's really boring.
Yeah. You can't just make stuff up.
I like writing fiction.
Yeah.
Nonfiction is surprisingly easy for me. I guess having written as much as I have, I do have a lot of quote unquote pearls of wisdom to share. So they're not difficult to write. And I never imagined myself teaching classes, but that's not difficult either. But I don't especially enjoy them. Like they don't spark joy, if you know what I mean. Yep. I can do them. They feel more like work, whereas fiction writing feels more like passion.
Yeah.
So I would say fiction work takes more effort, but it's more enjoyable work. It feels more like passion and fun. And nonfiction it's different.
Yeah.
It's a little stiffer.
Yeah. Is there anything you wanted to talk about, JD, before we broke?
I took Neil Gaiman's masterclass not too long ago.
How was that?
Are you guys familiar with that?
I'm familiar with the class and the
Neil
author.
Gaiman. I just finished that last week. And I actually have been talking to a lot of people about this because it's not what you would expect of a writing class. It's, I highly recommend it, but only after you guys have written at least one book. Only after you've written at least one book. Yeah. Because he talks a lot about the thinking processes of writers and how to handle yourself as an author. Some of those things wouldn't make sense if you don't have at least some experience first. I was listening to it and I was like, 5 years ago, I don't think I would have understood this class.
So I know you kind of touched on it earlier. So what's I guess kind of plugging all the stuff you're working on. So what's kind of next in terms of
the cozy fantasy is first. That's the one I'm gonna query. I've got that one working in probably the final draft right now. That's the one I'm gonna query, and I have some hopes for it. I think it's interesting enough that I could possibly get some attention. Excellent. When I was querying way back in the day, I've actually gotten 2 full manuscript requests, but they didn't lead anywhere, and it takes forever. It takes forever. I'm going into this with high hopes.
I'll tell you, the subgenre of fantasy, in my brain, it sells. Like I can picture like being on a blanket near a fire with a cup of chamomile, reading a nice cozy fantasy. I think it's a really cool subgenre.
Yeah, I'm hoping for that. And it's kind of a new genre, and there's not a whole lot of it because fantasy as a genre, there's certain expectations of like the high fantasy, the magic, the drama. So there's not a whole lot of cozy fantasy. And actually, that's something Neil Gaiman said in his class. He said genre is about what people expect to get out of it.
We'll throw it out there. What are you reading and watching right now?
I'm reading Stephen King's Fairy Tale.
Okay, yeah.
I'm a huge Stephen King fan. I've been a lifelong Stephen King fan.
Yeah.
I went through a phase of thinking I was going to be the next Stephen King in my teen years until I realized I'm no good at horror.
Oh no, I don't think I've grown out of that phase yet.
But I still love Stephen King, and I'm reading Fairy Tale. It's one of the newer ones. It is thick. Yeah. It is like 600 pages. It's gigantic.
Jeez.
And I feel like as Stephen King's gotten older, he's just leaning harder and harder into his whole nostalgia bend. I don't know if you guys read Stephen King, if you know that he's really into the nostalgia thing. Yeah. And this one is heavy on that. So it's a little slow going. It's good, but it's a little slow going. And I feel like when you're Stephen King, no one's going to nitpick at how long your book is. No. Everyone's probably scared to tell him to cut it down.
Stephen, can you cut this down 300 pages or so? Yeah, no, that's not happening.
So it's a gigantic book that you got to be patient with.
And how about watching anything? You any series or movies that you're watching these days?
I just watched the Frasier reboot.
And?
It's good. If you like Frasier, it feels just like the old Frasier. They did a great job. Like I was surprised at how well they captured. Frasier is kind of like the way back in the day,
Yeah.
one of those way back in the day sitcoms, and they really recaptured the flavor.
Oh, nice. I'll check that out.
Tim, what are you reading? What are you watching?
Let's see, Headspace.
Yeah, right.
I am halfway through Headspace by JD Edwin. It's great. I recommend it. You can find it on Amazon. Let's see what else. I finished the Write Fast system, which is very helpful. Otherwise, I have just started The Return of the King. I'm reading it to my kids before bed. So we are 4 into Tolkien's Middle Earth. So I read them The Hobbit, I read them Fellowship, finished Two Towers, and now we're into Return of the King, which is obviously phenomenal. And then I'm still kind of picking through White Noise again. It's like my comfort book.
It's been a long time since I read Lord of the Rings.
I read it to my kids so they fall asleep. Like especially if they're stressed out, if they've got like some Sunday scaries, it's going to be school. In Fellowship, it worked great because there was really long, flowing descriptions of bushes, mountains, and long rivers. And then,
how old are your kids?
12 and 10.
Okay.
But then right around Two Towers, the story really picks up, and then it was keeping them up. So I really tried to make my voice more boring, slow it down a little bit.
Have you tried audiobooks?
No, I haven't. And I'll say that's maybe not true. Years and years ago when they were toddlers, we would try audiobooks and podcasts, but it seemed to keep them up at the time.
Yeah.
But it's a good point. I should try that again.
My daughter's 9. Yeah, and she just finished listening to all the Harry Potter audiobooks.
Oh, wow. Cool.
That's a journey.
It is. It took 6 months. So audiobooks, so you don't have to sit there with them. But of course, if it keeps them up, sometimes they read a little too exciting.
Yeah, I think I've got this with everything, a romanticized vision of what I want. And I'm like, I want to sit by candlelight reading to my children. It's not candle, but like by booklight and reading. So
you've got the Hugo thing. Have you heard of that?
No.
It's a current trend that goes with like simple living stuff. It's Hygge. It's a Danish concept of cozy.
Yeah.
I've been reading books on that too.
I've heard of this.
So whenever you say that, I'm like, oh, it's Hugo.
Yeah. I think that's my perspective. So there is some kind of self-gratifying part of this where I'm like, I want to be this type of dad that does a thing. And then some days you're like, can you read to me? I'm like, I'm so tired. Like, I can't even look at Reddit right now. So no. And those would be good days for an audiobook. Otherwise, watching, I just watched a horror movie that was mediocre, Argentinian movie called When Evil Lurks. Act 1, awesome, worth the price of admission or the Shudder subscription. And then Act 2 and 3, it was like definitely needed some revision. And but Act 1 was amazing. Like my heart was in my throat for most of it. It was really, really scary. How about you, Russ? What are you reading? What are you watching?
I'm finally finishing Dune again, reading it for like the 3rd time. I don't know why it's taking me so long, but I'm like down to like the last 100 pages. I'll probably finish it today.
Dune is one I could not get into.
It's a slow book, man.
It's a little too, you got to really have a taste for that kind of thing. And some people do.
Yeah, I think that the first time I read it was a long time ago. Second time I read it, I remember getting stuck in like the second act and just being like, what? And then after watching the movie and then coming back to it though, I feel much better about it. And definitely the second act is just holy smokes. And I forget how much time passes. I'm like, oh my God. But enjoying it more so this time. So almost done with that. And then I'm reading this book called The Tourist, which is like a thriller, kind of straightforward espionage thriller.
I read Game of Thrones within the last 2 or 3 years.
Oh yeah.
It's I don't know. I'm not a fan. I know people love Game of Thrones. I'm not a fan.
So did you watch the show first and then read the books, or?
I read the books first and I started the show and I immediately saw some of the changes and I was like, I can't get into this.
Yeah.
But also with the books, the problem is by the 3rd book, everybody you care about is dead. Yeah. And there's all these new people and you don't care about them. So I'm like, I can't care about this.
Yeah. It's like I spent all this time with these other characters and you just killed them all. Great. Thanks. But yeah, and then I've got Headspace queued up after those 2. And then I finally watched Get Out the other day, which I know.
Cool.
I know. I'm so behind on it, but I finally watched that. Fantastic. And then right afterwards, I watched the Super Mario Brothers movie because I just needed something
Your palate cleanser.
I need something to go to sleep to. It was a fun one. So
I love Get Out, man. And then have you seen Us yet?
No, that's next. That's next on the list. So
I saw that in the theater and I walked out and I was like, I shouldn't even write. You know, it's one of those like, because I was so impressed by it and it had so many similar influences to what I have, which is like 80s horror, like Chud and Nightmare on Elm Street and, you know, Return of the Living Dead and stuff like that. It was the complete opposite of inspiring for me. I was like, I don't know if I have a voice in this genre that's as, I don't know, essential or poignant. And it really did a number on me. It took me like months and months and months to like get the confidence again. Because I don't think my book is necessarily similar, but I think thematically there's some themes there that were similar. That's all to say, I totally recommend it. I think it's maybe one of his more underappreciated movies.
Yeah.
But I loved it. I thought it was phenomenal.
Yeah.
Look, you have a voice and you author have a voice. Just look at the romance genre. Okay. There's like a billion authors churning out the same story 100 million ways, but it's the same story. So
I think what's tough, right, is like once you recognize, and I know you break it up in the right fast system, but I think one of our kind of Bibles was Save the Cat.
Mm-hmm.
And once you recognize the beats and you see the beats everywhere, it's really hard, at least for me, to see. Like I was watching the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie, right? And I was like, oh my God, this is just like my book. It's not, but it's got the same structure and it's supposed to
change a lot.
And sometimes that can be a little discouraging for me, even though we've got to operate inside of that, 10 to 15 beat structure. So I have this kind of imposter syndrome when I see similar bits of media that have the same arc, which is everything I would imagine.
Yeah, it's commercial fiction. Because we're writing commercial fiction and commercial fiction needs to read a certain way. It's just how it goes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't know. I think this is great. This is awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again for joining us and taking the time. Anytime you want to come back and chat about any bit of writing, let us know.
I'd love to hear more about the cozy fantasy.
Yeah,
so good luck on that. And
when that one's out for querying, maybe we can talk again.
Yeah,
I'd love it.
Absolutely. That'd be fantastic. So thank you again. And good luck with the cozy fantasy. And we'll stay in touch. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So that's our episode. We want to thank JD Edwin again for joining us. That was a great chat. So
also head over to jdedwin.com. You can check out all of her fiction. You can sign up for a newsletter and you can learn a bit more about the Write Fast system, which I kind of wish I learned about a little sooner.
What are we talking about next? So next episode, we're queuing up. I think we're going to get into themes.
Yeah, I think themes. I think that'll be good to chat about.
Yeah. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed it, you can follow us on Instagram, Writer Syndrome Books. We are Writer_Syndrome on Twitter. You can find all our episodes. Reach out to us if you have any feedback or want to chat. Hit us up at writersyndrome.com.